What would you do if the only thing standing between you and a field of 752 buried German mines was a man lying face down in the dirt, pressing his ear against the cold earth like some kind of primitive savage? What if every single military engineer, every radio operator, every decorated officer laughed at him, called his method stupid, backwards, a joke from the Stone Age? And what if that man, that so-called savage, was the only reason any of them walked out of that valley alive? Before we go any further, I need you to do something. Drop a comment right now telling me where you are watching from. What city? What state? What country? And if this channel has ever shown you something you have never heard before, something hidden, something they do not teach in schools, then hit that subscribe button. We need your help to keep bringing these buried stories to light. The algorithm buries truth. You can help us dig it out. Now let me take you back. Back to a frozen morning in November of 1944. Back to a narrow valley in the Hurtgen forest, somewhere along the German-Belgian border, where the 3rd Battalion of the 28th Infantry Division had been pinned down for 6 days. The Americans called it the Death Factory. The Germans called it nothing at all. They did not need to. They had already turned every square meter of that forest into a killing ground. The official army reports would later describe what happened in the Hurtgen forest as one of the bloodiest and most poorly planned operations of the entire European campaign. More than 33,000 American soldiers were killed, wounded, captured, or simply disappeared into the frozen mud. Trees exploded into wooden shrapnel, artillery shells detonated in the canopy, raining down splinters the size of bayonets. And beneath the snow, beneath the fallen leaves, beneath every path and clearing, the Germans had buried their masterpiece. Thousands upon thousands of shoe mines, Topf mines, S-mines, and the dreaded Glasmine 43, a pressure-activated device made almost entirely of glass, completely undetectable by the metal detectors the American engineers carried. Private First Class Leonard Nez had been with the 28th for 11 months. He had survived Normandy. He had walked through the ruins of St. Louis. He had seen things that no 19-year-old from Chinle, Arizona should ever have to see, but nothing prepared him for the Hurtgen forest. Nothing prepared any of them. Nez was Diné, Navajo. Born in a hogan on the eastern edge of the reservation, raised by a grandmother who still remembered the long walk, trained in the old ways before the Bureau of Indian Affairs School tried to beat them out of him. He had joined the army in 1943, not because he loved America, but because his grandfather had told him something he never forgot. The earth speaks to those who listen, and a man who can hear the earth can never be lost. The morning of November 19th began like every other morning in that forest. Grey, wet, cold enough to make your bones ache. Captain Harold Whitmore had gathered what remained of his company in a shallow ravine about 400 meters from the German line. They had been ordered to advance through a narrow valley toward the town of Schmidt, a strategic crossroads that had already changed hands 3 times in the past week. Intelligence reported the valley was clear. Intelligence was wrong. The first man to die that morning was Corporal Raymond Sutter from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. He was 22 years old. He had a photograph of his fiancée in his breast pocket. He took 3 steps into the valley and vanished in a column of dirt and fire. The explosion was so loud that men 50 meters away felt their eardrums rupture. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing left of Sutter but a crater and a single boot. Captain Whitmore ordered everyone back. The engineers were called forward. 2 men with SCR 625 mine detectors swept the area for almost an hour. They found nothing, not a single reading. The metal detectors hummed and clicked over the frozen ground, but the needles never moved. The Germans had learned. They had adapted. The new mines were made of wood, glass, and bakelite. They were invisible to American technology. Lieutenant James Fairbanks, the battalion's engineering officer, stood at the edge of the valley and stared at the ground like it had personally betrayed him. He was a graduate of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He had written his thesis on acoustic detection methods. He was supposed to be the smartest man in the battalion, and he had no idea what to do. That was when Private Leonard Nez walked forward. He did not ask permission. He did not salute. He simply walked past the engineers, past the officers, past the frozen bodies of the men who had tried to cross before him, and he knelt down in the snow. Then he did something that made every man watching think he had lost his mind. He lay flat on his stomach, turned his head to the side, and pressed his ear against the earth. Lieutenant Fairbanks later wrote in his field report that his first instinct was to order Nez back to the line and have him evaluated for combat fatigue. A man lying face down in a minefield was either suicidal or insane. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the look on Nez's face. Maybe it was the absolute stillness of his body. Maybe it was the fact that after 11 months of war, Fairbanks had learned that the textbooks did not have all the answers. Nez lay there for almost 3 minutes. No one spoke, no one moved. The only sound was the wind cutting through the bare trees and the distant rumble of artillery to the north. Then Nez stood up, brushed the snow from his uniform, and pointed to a spot about 2 meters to his left. "There," he said, "and there, and there. 3 more to the right, 2 behind that rock, 1 under the root of that tree." Fairbanks thought it was a joke. He thought the Indian had cracked under pressure like so many others. But Sergeant Thomas Kilpatrick, a hard man from Chicago, who had seen enough death to know when someone was telling the truth, walked forward with a bayonet and began to probe the ground where Nez had pointed. The first mine was buried exactly 14 centimeters below the surface. It was a shoe mine 42, a wooden box filled with 200 grams of TNT, topped with a pressure plate so sensitive that a child's footstep could trigger it. Kilpatrick found the second mine exactly where Nez had indicated, then the third, then the fourth. 7 mines in a space no larger than a dining room table, every single one exactly where the Navajo had said it would be. Captain Whitmore demanded an explanation. "How did you know? What did you hear?" Nez looked at him with eyes that seemed to belong to a much older man and gave an answer that would be quoted in military reports for decades to come. "The earth has a voice," he said. "The Germans tried to silence it. But they do not know how to listen." What Nez did not explain, what he could not explain to men who had never been taught to hear, was that every object buried in the ground creates a disturbance. The soil compacts differently. The moisture content changes, and when you press your ear to the earth, when you quiet your mind and open yourself to the voice of the land, you can hear it. A hollowness, a subtle deadness in the resonance, a place where the earth's song has been interrupted. This was not magic. This was not superstition. This was the accumulated knowledge of a people who had survived for thousands of years in one of the harshest landscapes on the planet. The Navajo had tracked game across the desert by listening to the ground. They had found water in places that looked like nothing but sand and stone. They had read the earth the way other men read books. And Leonard Nez had been trained by masters. Over the next 6 hours, Nez led the 3rd Battalion through the valley 1 step at a time. He would walk a few meters, stop, kneel, press his ear to the ground, and then mark the locations of the mines with small stones. The engineers followed behind him, carefully extracting each device and stacking them in piles that grew higher with every passing hour. By nightfall, they had recovered 112 mines from a stretch of ground less than 300 meters long. The Germans had planted them in overlapping patterns, clusters designed to channel advancing troops into kill zones where machine gun nests waited. Without Nez, the entire battalion would have walked directly into the trap, but the valley was just the beginning. Word of what happened spread through the division like wildfire. By the next morning, Colonel Charles Peterson, the regimental commander, had personally requested that Private Nez be attached to his headquarters unit. The request was denied. Division command did not believe the reports. They thought it was a case of battlefield hysteria, soldiers seeing miracles where there were only coincidences. They sent a team of military intelligence officers to investigate. Major William Hartley arrived at the 3rd Battalion's position on November 21st. With 2 assistants and an attitude that made it clear he considered the entire trip a waste of his time. He was a West Point graduate, a career officer who had spent most of the war behind a desk in London. He had never heard a shot fired in anger. He had never seen a man die, and he certainly did not believe that some reservation Indian could detect mines by listening to dirt. Hartley demanded a demonstration. He wanted scientific proof. He wanted measurements and data, and something he could put in a report that would not make him look like a fool. So they took him to a section of forest that had not yet been cleared, a patch of ground that the engineers had marked as potentially mined, but had not had time to investigate. Nez walked into the trees without hesitation. He moved differently than the other soldiers, Hartley noticed. His footsteps made almost no sound. He seemed to flow across the ground rather than walking on it, and when he stopped and knelt down, there was something in his posture that Hartley found deeply unsettling. It was the posture of a man who was communicating with something the Major could not see. Nez worked for almost an hour. He marked 17 locations with stones. Then he stood up, walked back to where Hartley was waiting, and said simply, "Those are the ones that will kill you." Hartley ordered the engineers to check every location. He watched as they probed the ground with bayonets, as they carefully brushed away the soil, as they revealed mine after mine after mine. 17 locations, 17 mines, not a single false positive, not a single miss. The Major's report, filed 3 days later, would become one of the most controversial documents of the war. He recommended that Private Leonard Nez be immediately promoted and assigned to train other soldiers in his detection methods. He wrote that the technique, while unconventional, demonstrated a level of accuracy that exceeded any technological solution currently available to the United States Army. He concluded with a sentence that would later be redacted from the official record. "We have spent millions of dollars developing machines to do what this man does with his ear and the ground. We have failed. He has not." The report was buried, classified, filed away in a folder marked Indigenous Combat Techniques and forgotten in a warehouse in Virginia. The Army was not interested in admitting that a Navajo private with an 8th-grade education had outperformed their best engineers. It did not fit the narrative. It did not fit the science. It did not fit the image of American technological superiority that the War Department was trying to project. But the men of the 28th Infantry Division did not care about narratives or images. They cared about survival. And in the weeks that followed, Private Leonard Nez became the most valuable soldier in the entire regiment. They called him the Listener. Some called him the Ground Walker. A few of the more superstitious soldiers called him something else, something they only whispered when they thought no one could hear. They called him the one who hears the dead. Because the mines were not the only things Nez could detect. He could also tell when men had died in a particular spot. He could sense the disturbance in the earth where blood had soaked into the soil. He could feel the weight of the departed. Nez never confirmed or denied these rumors. He simply did his work. Day after day, he walked ahead of the advancing troops, reading the ground, marking the dangers, guiding his fellow soldiers through landscapes that should have been impossible to cross. By the time the Hurtgen Forest campaign ended in mid-December, Nez had personally detected and marked 752 German mines. 752. Not a single soldier in his company was killed by a mine after he began his work. Not one. The numbers were extraordinary. The implications were staggering, and the Army did everything in its power to make sure no one ever found out. Private Leonard Nez was awarded the Bronze Star in a small ceremony in January of 1945. The citation mentioned meritorious service in combat operations. It did not mention the mines. It did not mention the listening. It did not mention that a young man from the Arizona desert had saved more lives than any piece of equipment the army had ever produced. When journalists asked about the remarkable survival rate of the 28th Infantry Division's 3rd Battalion, they were told it was a combination of good leadership and careful planning. When military historians wrote about the Hurtgen Forest campaign, they focused on the strategic failures and the appalling casualty rates. No one mentioned the Navajo who could hear the earth, but the men who were there remembered. They remembered the morning Nez led them through a field that intelligence had declared clear and found 43 mines buried in a diamond pattern around a disabled tank. They remembered the night he woke from a dead sleep and told everyone to move because he had felt something wrong in the ground beneath their camp. They found the mine 6 hours later, a massive Telemine 43, buried directly under where the command tent had been standing. They remembered the afternoon near the village of Comashite when Nez suddenly stopped in the middle of a road and refused to take another step. The patrol leader, a young sergeant named Wilson from Tennessee, argued with him for almost 10 minutes. The road had been cleared. The engineers had checked it that morning. There was nothing there. Nez did not argue. He simply knelt down, pressed his ear to the ground, and then looked up with an expression that Wilson would later describe as the saddest thing I ever saw. "They buried him here," Nez said. "They buried them all here." Wilson thought he was talking about mines. He ordered the engineers forward again. They found nothing. No mines, no explosives, no metal. The detectors showed clean ground, but Nez insisted they dig. He pointed to a spot near the edge of the road and said there. Wilson was about to refuse when one of the engineers noticed something strange. The ground in that area was slightly darker than the surrounding soil, slightly softer. They dug. 3 feet down, they found the first body. It was an American soldier, or what was left of one. The Germans had executed him sometime in the previous week, shot him in the back of the head, and buried him in a shallow grave beside the road. There were 4 more bodies beside him, 5 American prisoners of war, murdered and hidden in the earth. Their dog tags had been removed. Their identities were never confirmed. Wilson asked Nez how he had known. The Navajo looked at him with those ancient eyes and said something that haunted Wilson for the rest of his life. "The earth does not forget," he said. "The earth never forgets." That night Wilson wrote a letter to his mother in Nashville. He described what had happened. He described the bodies. He described the young Indian who had somehow known they were there. And he wrote a sentence that his family would keep framed on their wall for 3 generations. "I do not know what God is or where he lives," Wilson wrote. "But I think he speaks through men like Leonard Nez, and I think we are all too deaf to hear." The war continued. The 28th Division pushed deeper into Germany, and Private Leonard Nez kept walking, kept listening, kept reading the earth for signs of danger. But something was changing in him. The men who knew him noticed it first. He was quieter than before, more withdrawn. He spent hours sitting alone, staring at the ground, moving his lips as if he was speaking to someone no one else could see. Sergeant Kilpatrick, who had become something like a protector to the young Navajo, asked him once what was wrong. Nez took a long time to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "There is too much," he said, "too much death in this ground, too many voices. I cannot make them stop." Kilpatrick did not understand. He thought Nez was talking about the stress of combat, the accumulated trauma of months of constant danger. He recommended that the private be sent to the rear for a few days of rest. The recommendation was ignored. Nez was too valuable. The army needed him at the front. The final month of the war was the worst. As the Americans pushed into the heart of Germany, the mines became more frequent, more sophisticated, more desperate. The Germans knew they were losing. They were planting everything they had, turning every road and field and village into a death trap. And Leonard Nez walked through all of it, finding every mine, marking every danger, saving life after life while something inside him slowly broke. The last mine he detected was on April 15th, 1945, 3 weeks before the German surrender. It was buried in a flower garden outside a small house in the town of Colditz. A young private from Michigan named Robert Foster was about to step through the garden gate when Nez grabbed his arm and pulled him back. The mine was a modified S-mine, a bouncing Betty that would have launched into the air and detonated at waist height, spraying 360 steel balls in every direction. Foster would have been killed instantly, so would the 4 men standing behind him. Nez marked the mine and then sat down on the ground beside it. He did not move for almost an hour. When Kilpatrick finally came to check on him, he found the young Navajo crying, not sobbing, not making any sound at all, just sitting there with tears running down his face, staring at the ground. "I can hear them," Nez whispered. "All of them, every single one. They are asking me why. They are asking me why they had to die." Kilpatrick did not know what to say. He sat down beside the young man and put a hand on his shoulder. They stayed there together until the sun went down. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say. The war ended 3 weeks later. Private Leonard Nez was discharged in August of 1945 with a Bronze Star, a combat infantryman badge, and a medical notation that read, "Acute combat fatigue. Recommend psychological evaluation." The evaluation never happened. Nez went home to Arizona. He went home to the reservation. He went home to a land where the earth spoke a language he could finally understand. But the story does not end there. The story is just beginning. What happened to Leonard Nez after the war? What happened to the knowledge he carried? The technique that had saved hundreds of American lives? What happened to the official reports, the classified documents, the evidence that the United States Army had discovered something extraordinary and then deliberately buried it? These questions would take decades to answer, and the answers, when they finally came, would be more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. Because the Army had not simply ignored Leonard Nez. They had not simply forgotten about him. They had watched him. They had studied him. They had taken careful notes on everything he did, every mine he found, every inexplicable detection that their instruments could not replicate. And then they had started a program, a secret program, a program that would remain classified for over 60 years. A program that would take the ancient knowledge of the Navajo people and twist it into something that Leonard Nez himself would not have recognized. But that is a story for another day. A story that leads to secret facilities in the Nevada desert, to experiments that violated every principle of human decency, to a cover-up that stretches from the halls of the Pentagon to the highest levels of government. A story that some people will tell you never happened. A story that the evidence says is terrifyingly real. For now, let us remember Leonard Nez. Let us remember the young man from Chinle, Arizona, who lay down in the frozen mud of a German minefield and listened to the earth. Let us remember the 752 mines he detected. Let us remember the lives he saved. And let us remember that somewhere, buried in the classified archives of the United States military, there are documents that prove what he did. Documents that prove it was real. Documents that someone for some reason decided the American people should never see. The earth has a voice, Leonard Nez said. The Germans tried to silence it, but they do not know how to listen. Maybe we should start. Maybe we should all start listening. In the years that followed the war, Leonard Nez returned to the Navajo reservation and tried to rebuild his life. He married a woman named Ruth Yazzie in 1947. They had 3 children. He worked as a shepherd, tending flocks across the same land his ancestors had walked for generations. He rarely spoke about the war. He never spoke about the mines. But the war had not forgotten him. In 1951, two men in dark suits arrived at the Nez home in Chinle. They said they were from the Department of the Army. They said they wanted to talk about his service in Europe. They said it would only take a few minutes. Ruth Nez later told her children that the conversation lasted almost 4 hours. She was not allowed to be present. She was not told what they discussed. But when the men finally left, her husband was different, quieter, more distant. He spent the next 3 days sitting on a ridge behind their home, staring at the earth, refusing to eat or sleep. When she finally convinced him to come inside, he told her only one thing. "They want to use it," he said. "They want to use what I can do. They want to make weapons." Ruth asked him what kind of weapons. Leonard shook his head. "The kind that listen," he said. "The kind that never forget." The men came back twice more over the next year. Each time, Leonard met with them. Each time, he emerged more troubled than before. Ruth begged him to tell her what was happening, but he refused. He said there were some things too dark to share. He said there were some things that would break her if she knew. In the spring of 1953, Leonard Nez received a letter from the Department of Defense. The contents of that letter were never revealed. But 2 days after reading it, Leonard walked out into the desert and did not come back for 3 weeks. Ruth searched for him everywhere. The tribal police searched. Even some of his old army contacts were notified. No one could find him. When he finally returned, his hair had turned grey. He was 30 years old and his hair was completely grey. He looked, Ruth said later, like a man who had seen his own death. Leonard never explained where he had gone or what he had experienced. But from that day forward, he refused to listen to the earth. He would not even kneel down. He would not touch the ground with anything except the soles of his feet. Something had happened out there in the desert. Something had broken the connection that had made him unique. Or something had scared him so badly that he chose to sever it himself. The years passed. Leonard Nez grew old on the reservation. He watched his children grow up, get married, have children of their own. He became a respected elder in the community, known for his wisdom and his silence. People came to him for advice. They came to him for blessing ceremonies. They came to him because there was something in his eyes that spoke of knowledge too deep to express in words. But he never listened to the earth again. Not once. Not even when his grandson, a boy named Thomas, showed signs of the same gift. Leonard saw the way the child would stop suddenly in the middle of a field, tilt his head, and stare at the ground with an expression of intense concentration. He recognized the signs. He knew what they meant, and he did everything in his power to make sure Thomas never developed the ability. "Do not listen," he told the boy again and again. "The earth will speak to you. It will try to show you things, but some things are not meant to be seen. Some doors are not meant to be opened." Thomas did not understand. How could he? He was just a child. He did not know about the war. He did not know about the mines. He did not know about the men in dark suits and the letters from Washington and the 3 weeks his grandfather had spent alone in the desert, doing something that had turned his hair grey overnight. Leonard Nez died in 1987. He was 62 years old. The official cause of death was heart failure, but Ruth always believed it was something else. She believed his heart had been broken long ago, back in that frozen forest in Germany, and it had simply taken 40 years to finally stop beating. They buried him on a hill overlooking the valley where he had been born. The ceremony was traditional, conducted in the old way, with songs and prayers that had been passed down for generations. More than 200 people attended. Veterans came from across the country, men who had served with Leonard in Europe, men who had walked behind him through the minefields and lived because of his gift. They stood in a line at the edge of the grave and saluted as his body was lowered into the earth. Sergeant Thomas Kilpatrick, now 71 years old and walking with a cane, was the last to approach the grave. He stood there for a long time, looking down at the simple wooden casket. Then he knelt, pressed his palm against the freshly turned soil, and whispered something that no one else could hear. Ruth asked him later what he had said. Kilpatrick smiled, but there were tears in his eyes. "I told him, 'Thank you,'" the old sergeant said. "And I told him I was sorry. Sorry we never told the world what he did. Sorry we let them bury the truth along with everything else." Ruth nodded. She understood. She had lived with that truth for 40 years. She knew what it had cost her husband. She knew what it had cost their family. And she knew that somewhere, in a file cabinet in Washington or a vault beneath the Pentagon, there were documents that told the whole story. Documents that would never see the light of day. Or so she thought. In the summer of 2004, a researcher named Dr. Sarah Blackwood was going through declassified military records at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. Blackwood was a historian specializing in indigenous contributions to the American war effort, and she had spent years documenting the stories of Native American soldiers who had served in World War II. She had written extensively about the Navajo code talkers, the Choctaw Telephone Squad, the Comanche Signal Corps. She thought she knew everything there was to know about the subject. She was wrong. The file was mislabeled. It had been placed in a box marked Personnel Records, Quartermaster Corps, European Theatre, a collection so boring that no one had looked at it in decades. But Blackwood was thorough. She went through every box, every folder, every scrap of paper, and on a Tuesday afternoon in July, she found something that made her blood run cold. It was a report dated November 24th, 1944. The heading read, "Indigenous Combat Techniques, Subsurface Detection Methods, Classification Level Secret." The author was Major William Hartley, United States Army Intelligence. Blackwood read the report 3 times, then she read it again. Then she sat back in her chair and stared at the ceiling for almost an hour, trying to process what she had just discovered. The report described everything: Leonard Nez, the listening technique, the 752 mines, the perfect accuracy rate, the recommendation that the Army immediately begin a program to study and replicate the method. And attached to the report were dozens of additional documents: field observations, witness statements, technical analyses, photographs of Nez kneeling in the mud with his ear pressed to the ground. But that was not what made Blackwood's blood run cold. What made her blood run cold was the final document in the file. A memo dated March 15th, 1953, stamped with a classification level she had never seen before. The memo was addressed to the Director of Central Intelligence. The subject line read, "Project Earth Song, Phase 2 Authorization." The memo was short, only 3 paragraphs. But those 3 paragraphs changed everything Blackwood thought she knew about American history. Following successful preliminary trials at Site 7, the memo read, "We are prepared to proceed with Phase 2 of Project Earth Song. Subject N has demonstrated consistent results under controlled conditions. However, psychological deterioration has accelerated beyond projected parameters. Recommend immediate acquisition of additional subjects from target population. Suggest coordinated effort with Bureau of Indian Affairs to identify candidates with hereditary predisposition to subsurface acoustic sensitivity." Blackwood stared at the memo for a long time. Subject N, Site 7, additional subjects, target population. The language was clinical, detached, almost bureaucratic, but beneath the cold words she could see something horrifying taking shape. They had taken Leonard Nez. They had taken him to some secret facility and experimented on him. And when he broke, when his mind could no longer handle whatever they were doing, they had started looking for others. Other Navajo. Other indigenous people with the same gift. Other human beings to feed into their machine. Blackwood spent the next 6 months trying to learn more about Project Earth Song. She filed Freedom of Information Act requests. She contacted veterans organizations. She reached out to the Navajo Nation and asked if anyone had ever heard of the project. She hit dead ends everywhere. The CIA denied that Project Earth Song had ever existed. The Department of Defense claimed no records matched her request. The National Archives informed her that the file she had found had been mislabeled and should never have been in the public collection. When she went back to retrieve it, the file was gone. The box was still there. The other documents were still there, but the Earth Song materials had vanished. Someone had been watching. Someone had noticed. Someone had made the evidence disappear. Blackwood did not give up. She started digging into the personal histories of the men mentioned in the documents. Major William Hartley had died in 1978, but his widow was still alive, living in a retirement community in Scottsdale, Arizona. Blackwood flew out to meet her. Eleanor Hartley was 91 years old and sharp as a tack. She remembered her husband well. She remembered the war, and when Blackwood mentioned Project Earthsong, something changed in her face. The color drained away. Her hands began to shake. "He never told me what they did," Eleanor whispered, "but he used to wake up screaming. He used to call out names in his sleep, native names, names I did not recognize. And once, just once, he told me something that I have never forgotten." "What did he tell you?" Blackwood asked. Eleanor closed her eyes. When she spoke again, her voice was barely audible. "He told me they had found a way to weaponize the earth itself. He told me they had taken something sacred and turned it into something monstrous, and he told me that God would never forgive them for what they did." She would not say anything more. She asked Blackwood to leave. She said she had already said too much. She said there were people who were still watching, even after all these years. People who would do anything to keep the truth buried. Blackwood left Scottsdale with more questions than answers, but she also left with a name Eleanor had whispered as she was walking out the door, a name that Eleanor said her husband had repeated in his nightmares for 30 years. The name was Thomas Begay. It took Blackwood almost a year to track down information about Thomas Begay. The name was common on the Navajo reservation. There were hundreds of men with that name. But eventually, through a combination of military records, census data, and interviews with elderly residents, she found him. Thomas Begay had been born in 1932 in a small community called Rough Rock, about 40 miles from Chinle. He had served in the army during the Korean War. He had been honorably discharged in 1954, and then he had disappeared. Not disappeared in the normal sense. Not moved away or changed his name or started a new life somewhere else. Disappeared completely. Erased. His military record stopped abruptly in March of 1954. His social security number showed no activity after that date. His family reported him missing, but no investigation was ever opened. It was as if Thomas Begay had simply ceased to exist. Blackwood found his sister, a woman named Mary Begay Tsosi, living in a nursing home in Gallup, New Mexico. Mary was 87 years old, frail and ill, but her memory was clear. She remembered her brother. She remembered the day he disappeared. "They came for him in the night," Mary said. "Men in a black car. They said Thomas was needed for a special project. They said he would be back in a few weeks. That was the last time I ever saw him." "What kind of special project?" Blackwood asked. Mary shook her head. She stared out the window at the desert landscape beyond the nursing home. "Thomas had a gift," she said quietly. "The same gift our grandfather had. The same gift a few people in every generation of our family have had. He could hear things in the earth, things other people could not hear. I always thought it was a blessing, but now I think it was a curse." "What do you mean?" Mary turned to look at Blackwood. Her eyes were wet with tears that had been waiting almost 50 years to fall. "He wrote me a letter," she said. "Just one letter. About 6 months after they took him. He did not say where he was. He did not say what they were doing to him. He just said one thing, over and over again, the same sentence written 20 or 30 times on a single page. What did it say?" Mary reached into the drawer of her bedside table and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was yellow with age, the creases worn almost through from decades of handling. She handed it to Blackwood. Blackwood unfolded the letter. The handwriting was shaky, barely legible, the scrawl of a man whose hands were trembling so badly he could barely hold a pen. And there, repeated over and over in increasingly desperate strokes, was a single sentence. "They are making me listen to the dead." Blackwood sat with that letter for a long time. She tried to imagine what it meant. She tried to imagine what kind of experiment could break a man so completely that this was all he could write. She tried to imagine what Thomas Begay had experienced in that secret facility, what horrors he had been forced to hear, what voices had spoken to him from beneath the earth. She could not imagine it. The human mind is not designed to comprehend such things, but she kept digging, she kept searching, and slowly, piece by piece, she began to uncover the outline of something vast and terrible. Project Earthsong had not been abandoned after Leonard Nez returned to the reservation. It had been expanded, relocated to a facility somewhere in the Nevada desert, a place that did not officially exist, a place where the normal rules of law and ethics did not apply. And for almost 20 years, the project had continued. They had brought in subjects from across the country, men and women with hereditary sensitivity to subsurface acoustic phenomena. Navajo mostly, but also Cherokee, Lakota, Choctaw, members of tribes that had developed similar traditions over thousands of years. The subjects were recruited with promises of good pay and government benefits. Some were drafted. Some, like Thomas Begay, were simply taken. The experiments were designed to amplify and weaponize the listening ability. They used drugs, sensory deprivation, electromagnetic stimulation, techniques that would later be developed into the CIA's infamous mind control programs. They pushed the subjects to the breaking point and beyond. They forced them to listen for hours, days, weeks at a time. They forced them to hear things that no human being should ever hear. The dead. The Earth's memory of every act of violence, every moment of suffering, every scream that had ever been absorbed into the soil. The subjects heard it all. They heard battlefields from centuries past. They heard mass graves. They heard the echoes of genocide and slavery and all the horrors that humanity had inflicted upon itself since the beginning of time. Most of them went insane. Some of them died, and the ones who survived, the ones who somehow maintained their sanity through the ordeal, became something else entirely, something the project leaders called listeners. The listeners were deployed in the field, Korea, Vietnam, Central America. Wherever the American military needed to detect hidden threats, the listeners were sent. They could find buried weapons caches. They could locate underground tunnels. They could sense ambushes before they happened. They were the ultimate intelligence asset. Human beings transformed into living sensors, their minds permanently attuned to the voice of the earth, but they were also damaged beyond repair. The listeners could not turn off their ability. They heard the earth constantly, every moment of every day. They heard the dead crying out for justice. They heard the weight of all the suffering that had ever been, and one by one, they broke. The project was officially terminated in 1973 after a series of incidents that the surviving documents only hint at. One listener walked into a village in Laos and began screaming that he could hear the bones beneath the houses, that the entire settlement had been built on a mass grave from some ancient war. He was correct. Archaeological surveys later confirmed that the site had been a killing field during a regional conflict in the 15th century. But the listener did not live to see the confirmation. He had been shot by his own handlers, who feared he was about to reveal classified information. Another listener, stationed at a forward operating base in the central highlands of Vietnam, began reporting that the earth was speaking to him in a language he did not understand. He said it was not human language. He said it was older. He said it was the language the earth itself had spoken before humanity existed. 2 days later, he was found dead in his quarters. The official cause of death was suicide, but the medical examiner's report, which Blackwood found buried in the declassified files, noted something strange. The listener's eardrums had been ruptured from the inside. The project ended. The files were classified. The surviving listeners were dispersed to psychiatric facilities across the country, where they lived out their remaining years in medicated silence, and the world moved on, never knowing what had been done in its name. But here is the thing about secrets. They have a way of leaking out. They have a way of seeping up through the cracks, like water finding its way to the surface. They have a way of refusing to stay buried. In 2009, a retired CIA officer named Harold Whitman published a memoir about his years in the agency. The book was heavily redacted by government censors, but one passage survived intact. A passage that mentioned a program called Earth Song and the indigenous operatives who had been its subjects. They could hear things we could not imagine, Whitman wrote. They could sense disturbances in the ground that no instrument could detect, and they paid for that ability with their sanity, their health, and in many cases, their lives. We used them up and threw them away, and we never even had the decency to say thank you. The passage sparked a minor controversy. Veterans groups demanded more information. Indigenous rights organizations called for a formal investigation. Congressional representatives sent letters to the Department of Defense requesting the declassification of all Earth Song-related materials. Nothing happened. The requests were denied. The letters went unanswered. The controversy faded away, replaced by newer scandals and fresher outrages, and Project Earth Song retreated once again into the shadows. But Sarah Blackwood did not forget. She spent the next decade gathering every scrap of evidence she could find. She interviewed the families of the listeners. She tracked down medical records and psychological evaluations. She built a case file that ran to over 3,000 pages, documenting one of the most disturbing episodes in the history of American intelligence. And then, in the summer of 2019, something happened that changed everything. A man walked into her office at the University of New Mexico. He was old, easily in his 80s, with silver hair and a face carved by decades of sun and wind. He moved slowly, carefully, like a man who had learned to be cautious about every step he took, and when he spoke, his voice carried an accent that Blackwood recognized immediately. "You have been asking questions," the old man said, "questions about Earth Song. Questions about the listeners, questions about what they did to us." Blackwood stared at him. She could not speak. She could not move. She knew who he was. She had been looking for him for 15 years. The old man sat down across from her desk. He looked at her with eyes that had seen too much, eyes that carried the weight of secrets too heavy for any human being to bear. "My name is Thomas Bigay," he said, "and I have come to tell you the truth." Thomas Bigay spoke for almost 8 hours. He told Blackwood things that she had suspected, things she had feared, things that were worse than anything she had imagined. He told her about the experiments. He told her about the drugs and the deprivation and the endless hours of forced listening. He told her about the other subjects, the ones who did not survive, the ones whose minds shattered like glass under the pressure of what they were forced to hear. And he told her about what he called the deep listening, the final stage of the project, the point where the scientists pushed the subjects beyond all reasonable limits, trying to access something that lay beneath even the Earth's memory of the dead. They believed there was something deeper, Thomas said, something older, a consciousness embedded in the rock itself, in the bones of the planet. They thought, if they could tap into that consciousness, they could access a kind of omniscience. They could know everything that had ever happened, everywhere on Earth, all at once. Did they succeed? Blackwood asked. Thomas was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "Yes," he said. "God help us, yes, we touched it, we heard it, and it heard us. What was it? What did you hear?" Thomas shook his head. Tears were streaming down his weathered face. "I cannot describe it," he said. "There are no words in any human language for what we experienced." But I can tell you this. It was not mindless. It was not indifferent. It was aware. And it was angry. Angry about what? Thomas looked at Blackwood with an expression of infinite sorrow. About everything, he said. Every wound we have ever inflicted on this planet, every bomb, every mine, every act of destruction. The earth remembers, the earth feels, and the earth is waiting. Waiting for what? Thomas did not answer. He simply looked at the floor, at the ground beneath their feet, and shook his head. Some things are better left unheard, he said. Some doors should never be opened. Leonard Nez knew that. He knew it from the beginning. That is why he stopped listening. That is why he warned his grandson never to develop the gift. He had heard something in that German forest, something beneath the mines and the bodies and the frozen mud, something that told him what was coming. What is coming? Blackwood pressed. What did Leonard hear? Thomas Bigay stood up. He walked to the window and looked out at the desert landscape stretching toward the horizon. Judgment, he said quietly. The earth's judgment on those who have desecrated it. Leonard heard it coming. He heard the footsteps. He spent the rest of his life trying not to listen because he could not bear to hear them getting closer. He turned back to face Blackwood. I still hear them, he said. Every day, every night, getting closer, getting louder, the earth is waking up, and when it finally opens its eyes, God help us all. Thomas Bigay left Blackwood's office that afternoon and was never seen again. She tried to contact him, tried to find where he had gone, but he had vanished as completely as he had 50 years before. Perhaps he returned to the reservation. Perhaps he found some quiet place to wait for the judgment he had described. Perhaps he simply walked out into the desert and let the earth reclaim him. Blackwood published her findings in 2021 in an academic journal with a circulation of a few thousand readers. The article was titled Indigenous Acoustic Detection in World War II and the Origins of Project Earthsong. It documented everything she had discovered over 17 years of research, and it was completely ignored. No major media outlet picked up the story. No congressional investigation was launched. No official acknowledgement was ever made. The truth about Leonard Nez, about Thomas Bigay, about the hundreds of indigenous people who had been exploited and destroyed by Project Earthsong, remained buried, just like everything else. But the earth remembers. That is what Leonard Nez understood. That is what he tried to tell us. The earth absorbs everything. Every footstep, every explosion, every drop of blood that has ever soaked into the soil. It records it all, it holds it all, and somewhere, in the deep places where even the listeners could not reach, it is waiting. Maybe Leonard was right to stop listening. Maybe some truths are too heavy for human beings to bear. Maybe the voice of the earth is speaking words we are not meant to hear. Or maybe we should have listened all along. Today, the Navajo reservation stretches across 27,000 square miles of Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah. It is the largest Native American reservation in the United States. And if you go there, if you find the right elders and ask the right questions, they will tell you stories. Stories about ancestors who could hear the ground speak. Stories about warnings that came from the earth itself. Stories about a young man named Leonard Nez, who walked through a German minefield with his ear pressed to the frozen mud and saved 752 lives. They will also tell you other stories, darker stories, stories about what happened after the war, about the men who came in dark suits, about the experiments and the disappearances and the broken mines. Stories about things that are better left unspoken. Stories about sounds that should never be heard. And if you listen very carefully, they might tell you about the footsteps that Thomas Bigay heard, the footsteps that Leonard Nez spent 40 years trying not to hear, the footsteps that are still getting closer, still getting louder, still counting down the moments until the earth finally wakes. The ground beneath your feet is not empty. It is not silent. It is speaking to you right now in a language older than humanity, telling you things you do not want to know. And somewhere, In the deep places where the light does not reach, something is listening back, something that has been waiting for a very long time, something that remembers everything we have done. The next time you walk across a field, the next time you step onto bare earth, take a moment. Stop, listen, press your ear against the ground and see if you can hear it. The voice that Leonard Nez heard, the voice that Thomas Begay could not escape. The voice that has been speaking since before humanity existed and will be speaking long after we are gone. Most people hear nothing. Most people have forgotten how to listen. But some people, the ones with the gift, the ones with the curse, they hear it clearly. They hear the dead, they hear the memories, they hear the judgment coming, and they cannot make it stop. In times of darkness and uncertainty, in moments when the weight of hidden truths becomes too heavy to bear, there is only one source of true peace, only one voice worth listening to above all others, the voice of the Creator, the voice of the Almighty. Leonard Nez knew this. Despite everything he experienced, despite everything he heard in that frozen German forest and in the decades that followed, he remained a man of faith. He prayed in the traditional Navajo way. He honored the sacred traditions of his people. And he also knew that beneath all the voices of the earth, beneath all the cries of the dead, there was another voice, a voice of love, a voice of redemption, a voice of hope. In these last days, when the earth groans under the weight of all that humanity has done, when the old prophecies seem to be unfolding before our eyes, there is only one place to find refuge. Not in the secrets of governments, not in the technology of men, not even in the ancient wisdom of indigenous peoples, as powerful and as true as that wisdom may be. The only refuge is in God. The only hope is in Jesus Christ. The only path forward is the path of faith, of repentance, of turning away from the darkness and toward the light. Whatever you hear in the silence of the night, whatever voices speak to you from the depths of the earth, remember that there is a voice above all voices, a voice that spoke the world into being, a voice that called light out of darkness and order out of chaos, a voice that is still speaking today, calling each of us by name, inviting us to listen, inviting us to come home. Do not be afraid of what is coming. Do not be afraid of the judgment that the earth remembers. Place your trust in the one who holds all things in his hands, the one who knows the end from the beginning, the one who loves you more than you can possibly imagine. The earth speaks, the dead cry out, the footsteps grow closer, but God is still on his throne, and his love is still stronger than death. Listen carefully, not to the voices in the ground, not to the whispers of the departed. Listen to the still, small voice that speaks in the silence of your heart. The voice that has been calling to you all along. The voice that will never stop calling until you finally answer. That is the voice that matters. That is the only voice worth hearing. May you find peace in these troubled times. May you find strength in the arms of the Almighty, and may you never forget that no matter how dark the world becomes, no matter how loud the voices of judgment grow, the light of Christ still shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it.